Okay. Can you please say your name and spell your last name?
James A. Ponce, P-O-N-C-E.
Your birth date, please.
July the 19th, 1917.
War served in and your branch of service.
I was in the World War II and the Korean War, and I was in the United States Navy. During the Korean War, I was transferred to the Marine Corps. I was in the medics, and the Marine Corps has no medical department, so they have to come from the Navy. And I ended up in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, you see.
Your highest rank achieved.
First class petty officer.
This interview is taking place on the 11th of the 4th of November, the 2011 in West Palm Beach, Florida. There is no relationship between the interviewer and the narrator. The interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress at the behest of the Historical Society of Palm Beach County and Oxbridge Academy. Family details. So, can you tell us a little bit about your family and if they were involved in the war?
Oh, well, they weren't involved in the war. You want still tell you something about my family?
Yes.
One thing, my parents were old enough to be my grandparents because my mother had been married 3 times and my father had been married twice. They were 40 and 50 years old when when I was born. So that's why I say they were old enough to be my grandparents. My mother died just before I went into service, and my father died when I'd been in 6 months. So, you want something about our ancestry?
Any siblings? Any siblings?
I have 2 sisters. One of them is still alive at the age of 93.
Okay. What were you doing before you entered the service?
I was working at my father's funeral home. We had a funeral home there in St. Augustine.
Okay. Now, did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted.
Why did you enlist?
Because I wanted a clean bed to sleep in. The Navy provided that. Of course, the first night there, I realized what in the world I'm doing in the Navy when I can't swim. And they never succeeded in getting me to swim, so that was very rare for a sailor. So.
Was there a reason why you chose the Navy?
I just thought it would be something I'd like. In St. Augustine, there was quite a lot of boating and whatnot, and I had offers to even be an officer in the Army and turned it down. But,
can you go into detail about what you did at training camp?
I'm one of the very few sailors that you'll ever run into that never went to boot camp. And there are a lot of sailors can't believe it. But at that point, when I went into service, the facilities in Florida, the naval facilities, were so undemanded. They were working 7 days a week. And when we went to Jacksonville and were sworn in, there was about 20 of us that they said, we need you so badly, and since you have some knowledge, we're going to put you right to work, and you can go to boot camp later. And of course, in my case, they never got around to sending me to boot camp, which is, in fact, when I was in the receiving station in San Francisco, someone noted that it wasn't in my jacket and says, oh, we'll have to send you to boot camp. So I said, you're not going to send a first-class petty officer to boot camp, are you? So I never got there. So.
Was it easy or hard adapting to the military life?
No, I tell you, I'd been a scoutmaster. I had the largest Boy Scout troop in North Florida. And you know, camping and whatnot really gave me a little idea of what what the life would be like, you know. And so it, I have to admit I enjoyed my military experience.
How about the social life in the military?
Well, it was during World War II, one thing is the civilian population was so great to the serviceman. I can remember down in Hollywood, Florida, when I was at the gunnery school, people would stop when gasoline was rationed, pick you up, and make the kids sit in each other's lap to make room for you if you were hitchhiking. And I never had any trouble getting from Hollywood if I wanted to go down to Miami to go to a movie or something. I would stand on the corner where the bus left from, but I seldom, if ever, had to ride the bus. And there wasn't that much traffic. If you went into a bar that wasn't loaded with sailors, usually if there were men, older men there, it would be hard for you to even have to pay for a beer, even though they were only 20 or 25 cents a bottle in those days.
When you were serving in World War II in the Pacific Ocean, where exactly did you serve?
Well, we picked our ship up in Pittsburgh. Let's start at the beginning. And the trip down the Mississippi and the Ohio was wonderful. Of course, we were painted and outfitted for Europe. But before we got our ship even out of Pittsburgh, the invasion of Europe had taken place, and it was successful. So, in other words, we'd have been the second try. And so we had to stop in New Orleans in order to change the camouflage. And part of the way down, we painted over the blue with green and whatnot, changing. And they had to extend the conning tower because we had to take another ship to the South Pacific on top. I was on an LST, the biggest of the amphibious vessels, you know. So we were 10 days in New Orleans, and so I got a chance to go home for 5. Half the crew went, the other half went the next 5 days. And of course, just as soon as we got out of New Orleans, we hit a hurricane. Now, oddly enough, during the war, hurricanes were military secrets, you know. And so then we went to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and from there, the Canal Zone. And then 57 days after we left New Orleans, we arrived in Espiritu Santos in the South Pacific, in the New Hebrides Islands. And from there, we went to Manus, in the Admiralty Islands. And the port there, the harbor there, is a natural one, and it's one of the finest in the world, but it's on a small island and no particular use, although the Navy had a tremendous amount of battleships, aircraft carriers, and everything else there. It was just, when we sailed into the day, it just made you get excited, because up to that point, I'd been in the Navy for 2.5 years, and I hadn't really seen any fighting force. So to suddenly go into that harbor and see those battleships lined up and the aircraft carriers and things like our LST, we went into the inner harbor, you know. So from there, we went to Hollandia, New Guinea, and stayed there until we were ready to take off for the invasion of the Philippines, you know. And I remember so well the first muster after we got to sea on the way with the gigantic convoy, you know. It looked like as far as you could see in any direction were ships heading for the Philippines. And that's when the captain told us that we would be hit by kamikazes. You know, they, I guess they had kept it under covers up to that point, but they knew the Japanese were going to use that as a weapon against us. One thing they quickly did is they decided that in the early part of the attack, the only plane they would use is the P-58, I believe, 38, the one with the two fuselages. So there was no way to mistake it for, any of our other planes would have looked like very similar to Japanese planes. And of course, anything that came along that didn't have two fuselages we shot at, and unfortunately shot down more than one American plane.
You mentioned an LST. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what that is?
It stood for, it was the largest of the landing ships. Very early on when Roosevelt was visiting Churchill, Churchill says, we absolutely have to have a fairly large landing craft. Is the only way we can put that many men ashore in the time enough to take the wherever we landed on Europe. And so he sort of sketched it, and Roosevelt went back and they quickly started designing it with, had a tank deck on the lower level, and the bow only drew 18 inches of water, so we could go right up on the beach with it, And then it had a big ramp that came down, and you could drive the trucks. And even on the deck itself, the bridge and all was at the very back end of the ship, so that you could park trucks and tanks and whatnot on the top, and they had a ramp that would come down to get those things off. And one of the interesting things is it only took a short time to design the ship, but to design an engine takes quite a while. And you know what powered them? We had two locomotive electric units sitting there. So the LST was actually an electric ship. And they thought if they made one landing, they'd have been worthwhile. But they didn't know how well they were going to actually work out. So fortunately, they did much better as far as surviving. And they had hundreds of them. And most of them were made inland, like mine was made in Pittsburgh at Neville Island. Mrs. Hines from the Pickle Company was the godmother, and our ship was called the Pride of Pittsburgh. And let's see, they launched it on Memorial Day, and it went down on the 28th day of December. So then they built the Pride of Pittsburgh to take our place. So.
Can you describe what you were doing on December 7th, 1941?
December 7th, 1941. I was assisting in embalming a man that later turned out to be a bicycle man that had worked with bicycles, and he had helped the Wright brothers create the first plane, because they used bicycle chains and whatnot to operate the propellers. And his son was saying, I just can't believe, because his father was very much involved in aviation, and the fact that because while we were embalming the man to be shipped north, we had got a radio was sitting under the embalming table, and while the bulletins were coming in from Pearl Harbor, and it was so unique that the person that we were actually working on at that moment would have had something to do with the first plane getting up in the sky. So
you were a medic in the Army, correct?
Yeah.
What did you do as a medic?
Well, let me explain is why I was able to go right to work. First of all, I was an apprenticed embalmer, so I knew something about the human body, because and also I had the Boy Scouts of America first aid instructor's certificate, and I had instructed in first aid. So that's why they felt that I could go to work right away in a dispensary, you know, a naval dispensary. So I went to the dispensary at the main side of NAS Jacksonville, that huge naval base they had up there. And then I was transferred after a few weeks down to Hollywood, Florida. And the next 18 months, I was at the Naval Aerial Gunnery School. And I remember that at that point, because this was the summer after Pearl Harbor, that they had immediately taken over the thousands of hotel rooms and motel rooms, and also the fact that it was warm in Florida, that just tremendous percentage of people in training were right here in Florida. Like Miami Beach was all Army Air Force. We didn't have our own Air Force then. When they got ready to go to lunch, all the traffic had to stop because they marched right down the street to the mess halls, you know. They couldn't, the hotels they were living in couldn't feed them. They were too small a unit. So on the golf course that ran through Miami Beach, they built temporary mess halls, you know, to feed them. Over on the Miami side was all the Navy, and the admiral that had this naval district, he's the only one that didn't have a ship. He had a building in downtown Miami because it was in totally for the aviation part of the Navy, you know, all the way from Pensacola to Jacksonville to Key West, and and why did we have a Naval Aerial Gunnery School? Because unfortunately, a lot of gunners shot at the target, and they had to learn to lead the target, you see, in order to hit a plane. And the chief, he was a sportsman. He was supposed to be one of the best skeet and trap shooters in the United States. He went to the Navy and said, you know something? The speed of a shotgun shell and a clay pigeon is in direct proportion to a machine gun bullet in an airplane. And they said, we'll buy it. So they created the Aerial Gunnery School, and the sailors that were going to be manning guns aboard airplanes, they started out shooting skeet. You know, they throw the clay pigeons up, and believe me, you'll never hit one if you don't lead it, you know, especially since they were all doing like this, you know. And then they gradually moved them up to where they were shooting machine gun bullets. And I tell you, that man was clever. Before he got there, or I mean, as they were setting things up, you know, when you got to where you had sleeves and shot machine guns at the sleeve, going back and forth and trying to hit it. And you know why all of you could have been shooting at the same sleeve, and afterwards we'd know how many times you hit? Because before you shot the gun, you went and across all your bullets you put green paint, blue paint, red paint, yellow paint, you see, so that you could read. And then you had to close the most gunnery ranges down to bring the target in. But he got all of the rabbits from the Greyhound tracks, and he had a switch, so they ran back and forth like this, and then they threw the switch and it came all the way to the firing line. So all the rest of the ranges, the rest of the range didn't have to shut down while you got your target and were able to count how many times you hit the thing. And eventually they even brought in planes and they shot at the targets. Of course, one little fella got excited and shot at the tow plane, but which didn't go over very well, I don't. But those things happen, you know, when you're trying to get ready for a big war. And our aerial gunners, the first time they saw action was in the Battle of Midway. and they did very well, as we know.
The Battle of Leyte Gulf was significant for a lot of reasons, like the kamikazes. What do you recall from being in that event?
Well, of course, you know, from the time that the war had started and MacArthur had to leave the Philippines, apparently very reluctantly, and he made his famous statement, "I shall return." And of course, there he was in Australia, and of course, most of the emphasis was going to Europe, you know, and of course, and rightly so, because in no time at all we could have lost all of Europe, and poor England had to stay there fighting, holding the fort until we could get strength enough to help them re-enter Europe. But finally they were able to, once they had successfully landed in Europe, then they turned all their efforts to the Japanese. And of course, there was no way to attack the Japanese without first taking the islands, which had airports. You know, they were like stationary aircraft carriers in between, you know. So from Hollandia, the first landing was a little island called Biak, and because it was just about halfway in between, and we had to have that airport because the planes couldn't fly all the way to the Philippines and land on the airstrip there without stopping and refueling. And our cargo was rather interesting. We were carrying the top pilots in the Army on our ship. Major Bong, he was one of the leading heroes of the Pacific War. And he was sleeping in the bunk right in the next compartment to me on the way over, because they used scrub pilots, including gals, to fly the planes from Biak to the Philippines, but they had to strip them down. They couldn't even carry ammunition or guns. So as soon as they landed on the, that was the main thing we had to do, was take an airstrip. It was called Tabloken. And just as soon as we secured it. Then the other thing that we had aboard our LST, and this is why we were in the middle of the convoy for protection, we had a duck. You know, that was one of those amphibious vessels. And that duck had been remade, and it was a control tower. So once they went ashore and pulled up alongside the airstrip, then they had a control tower to bring the planes in and get the planes out. Needless to say, they had another ship with another control tower just in case we were lost. But our most valuable cargo was that shipload of top pilots that went to the Philippines on a landing craft. And since when Mr. MacArthur decided to come ashore on I think it was the second day, he was going to do it right there where the Tabloken airstrip was, and so we were still up on the beach. So it was about 200 yards, you know, from us, and he came on a much smaller boat, and I think he could have had a dry landing, but that wouldn't have been very photogenic. So they stopped a little out so he could get into the water and walk ashore, and we were all watching, and we'd manned all the guns, you know, on our ship on that part of the beach, just in case a plane might try to come through. And then no sooner did he walked ashore, he went back and got on the ship again, and then he walked ashore again. Of course, you know, it was one of those very, very important moments of the war, that General Douglas MacArthur returning to the Philippines. So photography wasn't like it is today. We can look and see what we're getting. So they did it 3 times. And Secretary of State Al Haig heard me telling a group about the triple landing, you know, And after he took an exception, he thought I was making fun. I said, then I explained to him that no, it was, you know, that it was, I said, they put the flag up 2 or 3 times in Iwo Jima, and it was one of the most important symbols of the war, you know, but it was done several times so that photographers could get it. And you know, bless his heart, a couple of months later, he ran into me again, and he says, well, you were right. I says, what's the matter? Why? And he says, I was watching some film of the South Pacific War, and he says, and they were showing MacArthur returning, and his pants were wet up to the knees when he got off the boat. So I was glad that I got vindicated in the eyes of the who had been Secretary of the State, you know, and it was, and you know, there at Leyte, they claim there were over 300 ships in Leyte Gulf, you know, and so it was, and of course, it wasn't long after we got there that the shipload of wax arrived, and when I finally got about the 3rd day, I got to go ashore, and a Red Cross worker gave me a donut and a cup of coffee. I said, they got things organized in a hurry. First of all, the Japanese had no idea where we were going to head for. They knew it would be one of the islands with an airstrip on it. And there are dozens of islands in the Philippines. So that certainly gave us an advantage, you know. But then there was one part of that campaign that was underplayed, and that was the fact that there was a Japanese fleet heading down, and unfortunately they had 2 fleets, and they decided that the false one was the real one. And so Admiral Bull Halsey headed out to intercept it. And unfortunately, the 2 largest battleships ever made were leading that attack force that was coming around the backside of the Philippine Islands. And in a matter of time, they could have sunk everything sitting in, if they'd have broken through. And the only thing we had to stop them were the old battleships like the Mississippi that were used mostly for softening up beachheads. And in fact, we had gone out to take the casings off. You know, the firing part of those big shells is all brass and copper. And we were taking them to take them back to Hollandia to ship them back to the United States. And so they gave us orders to get off. In fact, the last line, they used an axe because by the time we were moving, they were under full draft. And before we were dropping smoke, smud, they'd have these big containers, you drop them in the water and it creates smoke. And we were dropping them as we went in. And before we got back into Leyte Gulf, those big guns were opening up. And there was the one moment, I think, that the Navy was able to cross the T. The perfect thing is if you have enemy Lorona ships, if you can cut across, firing in both directions. That was Admiral's dream. But it happened because, first of all, the Japanese ships couldn't maneuver in that narrow inlet. They never dreamt they'd come through it. And so with the battleships here, and they were the old ones, and the PT boats, I think the PT boats, the only thing they aimed for was the rear of the ship. In other words, if they could knock out the steering mechanism. And the battleships, they were aiming it for the bridges, you know. And that was one use. Imagine that lead battleship was bigger than the Bismarck or any of the other battleships made, and much bigger than our biggest ones like the Missouri and the New Jersey, you know. So, but that was Mr. MacArthur's day, and So that famous battle got very, very little publicity. But it was the last, absolutely, the last full battleship naval engagement that will ever be fought, you know, because the Battle of Midway had already told us that the Air Force, I mean aircraft carriers, would do it, but we still had to build battleships because we knew the Japanese were building battleships, you know. So, but they only saw a few minutes action. No. What else you want to know about?
While you were in the war...
I didn't mean to get so far from the...
No,
but it comes back to me.
Knocked out a couple questions there in between.
Uh-huh.
While you were in the war, how did you stay in touch with family and friends? And when you made friends in the war, did you stay in touch with them after the war was over?
Well, you could write letters, but of course they had to be censored, you know. And of course, you occasionally got mail, if you were moving around real fast, but the military did quite a good job of keeping you with incoming mail because it was very important. And and they had some abbreviated type mail, what was V-mail or something, I forget the name of it, that you know, you could send messages and so forth. And and I was very fortunate. There was Mrs. Dowling, God bless her. She was the wife of the chairman of the troop committee, and I spent a lot of time at their house hanging out. And she wrote me nearly every week, and I saved the letters, and I've turned them over to the Historical Society in St. Augustine, because believe me, it's a written document of what it was like for the civilians, and what was, you know, she would tell me that last week we had a practice, you know, air alert and all the different things, and we just got word that Frank Piet had been lost in the Philippines, you know. He was one of my Boy Scouts. And but they're all in these long letters that she wrote me. And and she knew I loved chocolate chip cookies, and when there I am in the midst of the thing, right after the invasion of the Philippines, my Christmas box of chocolate chip cookies arrived. So that was and I'm so glad that I saved him, because I'm sure that so many people didn't, and so much information from that period will be forever lost.
Where were you when the war ended, and when you got home, how did your family welcome you?
Well, you know, after, of course, the Navy sends a message, like my sister was listed, my closest relative, and that I had been injured, and that they'd send further information, or I would contact them. And so naturally she was apprehensive, and it took us quite a while to get from Hollandia back to San Francisco. I never forget when we arrived in San Francisco on Valentine's Day. So I sent my sister a telegram saying, "Your favorite Valentine arrived safely in USA today." So and you know, people, a lot of said, "Oh, you don't know how bad off he's injured, you know," but she didn't think that I would be that bad off, or she'd have then most likely told her. So, and you know, in the Navy, if you lose a ship, then you get 30 days leave. And so, you know, I was able to go home and visit. I also had a sister in Palm Beach, so I had to come down and spend some time in Palm Beach also. And there you go. Rest of the time I was in St. Augustine. then when I went back, for some reason they didn't think that I was in mental condition to go back. And here I was begging to go, but they sent me to, first to the receiving building on Market Street in San Francisco. And I was assigned as a medical aide to the Russian delegation to the peace conference when they created the United Nations. And it was very interesting to have witnessed that. And I actually saw him sign the creating the United Nations. It was in the Opera House there in San Francisco. And got to see a lot of celebrities, Anthony Eden of England, Harry Truman, President of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, Stettinius, all these people that had, come for the creation of the United Nations, and it was. After that was over, I was sent out to the receiving station in Shoemaker, California, which is just behind Oakland, out there in the valley. And from there, I was further transferred as the master-at-arms of the sick bay in the Naval Penitentiary at Shoemaker. I thought I sort of resented it, but when I found out I had a private room and an orderly and everything, it turned out to be, and I was able to help a lot of the prisoners that were having problems, and so I enjoyed that last. And that was there. Oh, you asked me that I was there when the Japanese surrendered, and then they had what was called the peace riots. Because I was fortunately I was able to get in town. In most places they closed the base down and kept the military on them, but around San Francisco they didn't, and things got out of hand. And I think the first thing to get torn up were the liquor stores, and so I think, if I remember, there were 8 people killed on Market Street or thereabouts during the peace riots, and then they finally rounded everybody up and sent them back to the base. But we had quite a time of it, celebrating the end of the war there. So, and I remember so well when the 3rd Fleet under Bull Halsey came back to San Francisco and proudly marched down Market Street, because that was after everything was over. So,
okay. Where were you born?
St. Augustine, Florida.
Hometown, okay. When did you enlist in the war, and where did you enlist?
Well, it was August of 03. I mean, of 43. I don't know the exact date, but at a recruiting station in Jacksonville, Florida.
Can you explain what a corpsman is?
A what?
A corpsman?
A corpsman?
Oh, corpsman.
And the people that deal with run the sick bays and take care of the patients, and it's the Navy's medical department. They changed it after. By the time I got back in it during the Korean War, they called them hospitalmen. They changed it from corpsman to hospitalman.
You mentioned the Japanese kamikazes. Can you tell us more about them?
Well, I tell you, when a plane, they're way up there in the sky, and when they peel off and start down, there may be 300 ships in Leyte Gulf, but you decide that thing is heading right for me. And to see all those guns from all those ships, and once again, they had tracers. Every so many bullets had a tracer on it, so you could see where they were going. And invariably, the cone of fire would assemble behind the plane. Then it would move forward and overtake the plane. And we did. I don't know that there were any ships that were actually hit by a kamikaze, because there was so much firepower. So many anti-aircraft guns that at least I didn't. I later would get to see ships hit by kamikazes, but I didn't see. There may have been, because Leyte Gulf is quite big, but we did pretty good as far as protect. And then they had those aircraft carriers and the old battleships there, and they were doing their part, to protect us.
So you were never on a ship then that was ever sunk in combat?
My LST was sunk in combat.
What was the name of your LST?
LST 750.
It was
Pride of Pittsburgh.
Right. Okay. Can you tell us about Major Bong?
Well, all I know that he was one of the top aces, Air Force aces in the Pacific. So naturally he was highly decorated, and he was one of the pilots that we carried to the Philippines.
Where were you when President Roosevelt died?
I was on the receiving station there on Market Street in San Francisco, and obviously a Republican sailor, if this is such a thing, I was just sort of flaking off, laying in my bunk, and it was a high-rise building, and he came in and says, "Your boy's dead." And I said, "Who?" And he says, "Roosevelt's dead." And I said, "Now stop." And I remember I looked across the street, and I could see the flag on the top of Wells Fargo coming down, and I would just, this chill was unbelievable. And I sat up and I said, "Oh my God, Truman is president." I didn't realize what a wonderful president he turned out to be. And I had a cup of coffee with that man when he was a senator, checking on excessive ships companies. He was going around to the various bases to be sure that they didn't have people that weren't necessarily tied up on the bases. And when he came by to see our little sick bay, my secretary, naturally she made 3 times as much as I did, had gone ahead and made the coffee, and he walked in, he says, "Oh, that coffee smells." He says, "The rest time you go look, I'm going to have a cup of coffee." So he sat down with us and had a cup of coffee. So, but I was kind of shocked when he became president. And
when Pride of Pittsburgh was sunk, when the Pride of Pittsburgh was sunk, what was your reaction to it?
Well, I'd been hit in both legs. I had a broken shoulder. I'd already given myself a couple of syringes of morphine because I carried on for the rest of the day, taking care of the others. I had one of the mess sergeant cooks strapped my arm to me, and I said, "Now you stay with me. You're going to be my hands." And he took care of bandaging people, and so it was late that afternoon that I finally collapsed, and then they put me to bed, and until later that night we were hit, and we ended up out in the China Sea, and the first ship that came along threw us a line, and but before we would start up the ladder, I don't know how they were going to get me up there, but because it was a cargo ship, someone on the raft asked, "What is your cargo?" And when he said airplane gasoline, we said, "No, we don't want to come aboard." And the skipper was way up there on the bridge, and the officer was on the deck. And he says, "What's going on down there?" He says, "Sir, they don't want to come aboard on account of our cargo." He says, "Well, leave them there." So we waited until a small amphibious vessel came along and picked us up. So because we had seen an ammunition ship kamikaze, you know, just that day before, and to see that explosion was, and it was just a short. We were a floating wreck after that ammunition ship blew up, you know, and they were towing a small amphibious vessel, and so were we. There was nothing. We had a line hanging out in the water, you know, after that explosion, and that's where I broke my, you know, my shoulder was pieces of that ship coming back down, and fortunately I had my Navy life preserver, which is well padded, and it ripped. That it would, if I didn't have that on, I would most likely have killed me. So.
When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were hit, what was going through your mind?
The what?
When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were hit, what was going through your mind?
Oh, I thought, thank God, because we were there at the receiving base, even with the prisoners. The psychiatrists were going through them to see who they could salvage and send back to service, because the invasion of Japan would have been, the loss of life would have been tremendous, you know. So that while it was terrible that many people lost their life at one time, anytime with a lot of young people, I said, you know, if they object or think it was a horrible thing to do, that Truman made a mistake, I'd say it's very possible that 2 or 3 of you wouldn't be sitting here today if he hadn't have dropped the bomb, because the casualties would have been so great, because the Japanese I think, would have fought to the very last man, because I'd seen how they were, and so believe me, when it was dropped, I personally thought it was so glad it worked.
So you were in favor of dropping?
Oh, yes.
Okay. How has the wartime experiences affected your life, and what have you learned from it?
You know, basically, even sitting here today, I think I'm talking about another life that I lived. You know, it has so little to do with me today, you know, and maybe it's because I'm 94 and it took place quite a distance back, but you know, it's like almost being in a movie, you know, and then suddenly the thing is over, you know. It's because after all, the military, whether it's naval or on ground or whatnot, it's so different than anything to do with civilian life that in fact, I seldom talk about it. In fact, sitting here today, I didn't realize I remembered as much about what happened as I did, because some of the things I've told you today, I don't know that I've ever mentioned them to anyone before, because I don't avoid if people ask me questions about what happened during the war, but I just I don't bring up the subject, so to speak.
Okay. Those are all the questions that I have. Do you have? I've asked all my questions.
Did you ever serve in action on land? Or were you always on a ship?
Well, when I was at the gunnery school, I was stationed on land. You know, we were operating a gunnery school, and for a lot of the time, I was stationed at the gunnery range, which is where West Hollywood is today. That was out in the woods in those days, and that was the you know, when I first got in, I didn't spend a great deal of time at NAS Jacksonville, but I was working at the main dispensary right down in the middle of it, and
Excuse me, I should clarify. When you were in the South Pacific,
Mhm.
were you ever on land in combat, or were you on your ship always whenever you went into action?
No, we didn't. But I tell you something, that day when that battle started, I told you about, when we were going back into the Leyte Gulf, we received orders. They dropped code. Everything was going to be in English, for speed, and the captain kept us abreast of everything. And one of the orders were to prepare to take your crew with movable guns ashore to stand with the Army.
Hey, Jim.
I'm sorry.
No, that's quite all right.
I never forget that moment. You know, I was so proud of our Navy and everything, and I thought, my God, if this doesn't work out. Yeah. But fortunately, we didn't have to. We didn't have to go ashore with the Army. You see, I hadn't thought about that in years. What's the next question?
Jim, if I could jump in. We had Alvin Urzek here, who was in the European theater. And before we began taping, he asked if he could just say something. And parts of this are going to be seen by every single Oxbridge student from now until I leave, whenever that'll be.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a message that you'd like to just say, you know, just something that you'd like to tell the kids of today? Because you've got an audience now of high school kids, and we've got a good group at this school. But is there's just, like that moment you just had, I've been trying to tell the kids that 1942 was a very rough year, and my parents and grandparents made a point of saying that they were worried, and they didn't know what was going to happen. Now, history today is very easy for us to look back. We know we won. Okay, but in 1942, that wasn't the case. And I just think that all of us today that haven't been through the experiences that you guys have had, we take so much for granted, and we're jaded. And is there some message that you'd like to leave that I could share with everybody? And I hate to put you on the spot. I should have given you fair warning on this.
Oh, well, you know, what's the name of the TV man that wrote the...
Tom Brokaw.
Tom Brokaw. God bless him, I got to talk to him when he was here. And that certainly was our finest hour. I'm trying to think back, but like when we went to get our ship, the people that were working on it wanted to give us a party before we left Pittsburgh and headed down the river, you know. And they gave us one hell of a party. And even Mrs. Hines, the godmother of our ship, she gave us a dinner up on the William Penn Hotel in the Mirror Room. I can even remember the name of the room. And of course, the funny thing is, we had cocktails before with hors d'oeuvres. Well, you know, some of them country boys that were sailors, they didn't know what an hors d'oeuvre were. They were picking them up like a chicken picking up corn. And so it was, but you know, it just shows to what a nation can do when they put their mind to it, and we certainly did on that occasion, you know. And unfortunately, we've pretty much lost all the wars we've fought since then, you know. We still have an army, and Korea, Vietnam was a total bust, and I don't know if we're going to do much better in the last two wars that came along. So I kind of think that it would be better off if we stayed home, but they don't ask me. So that, I guess as long as there's people, we'll have wars. One thing that I think about once in a while is that we fought a very important war, and that was the Cold War. And thank God we won it, you know, because the two nations produced enough atomic bombs to completely annihilate the population of the world, you know. And I just don't know what they thought they were going to do with all those bombs, because and what would be left after they used them. So let's hope that we get nervous when another nation is about to get hold of an atomic bomb. And I've seen ammunition ships blow up, and of course that's small fry compared to the atomic thing. So those were nervous times, but let's hope that the people of today put their heads together, and we have nothing as nice as peace, and it's that's I just don't know, you know. And when you get to be 94, you feel like your days have already passed, and but I'm glad that I'm still able to recount. Yeah. And I had no idea that I could remember as much as I did today. And for any of you that see it, and you know, one thing about a war, no two people see the same picture, you know, because your experiences are slightly different. So your grandfather or whoever that was in the war, they most likely have a much different story to tell. So, and I'm delighted I could pass on what I remembered of my experience. Thank you.
Lee has a question.
What was your favorite, most happiest memory out of the whole experience?
Of the war?
Of the war, yeah.
Well, I don't know about that. One of the greatest thrills was the shadow of the Golden Gate Bridge. It was at night when it crossed the bow of our ship, bringing us home. I tell you, you could absolutely, you know, there's lights on the, and it cast a shadow. And days before we got there were all sorts of pools betting the hour and the minute that shadow was going to hit the bow of the ship. You know, you could get in a 50-cent pool, a $5 pool, and the executive officer himself was standing there to clock the shadow's arrival, you know. But when it passed over you, it was just like a mother's arms and embracing you. Is that going under that Golden Gate Bridge and feeling the shadow of it pass over you? And believe me, you could feel it, you know.
What was food like in the Navy?
Good, bad, and indifferent. You know, it all depends. We had a pretty good staff aboard. We were lucky. And, you know, they were having to put crews together so fast that you couldn't end up. And like the baker went over the hill before we left from from New Orleans. But we picked one up in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So, and he turned out to be pretty good. And I remember I ate the second to last egg that we had aboard the ship. But the best food I had was when I was attached to the Marine Corps during Camp Lejeune, because the base where we were having the training corpsmen to be fighting Marines in 6 weeks. We also had the cooks and bakers school, and so sometimes we had all kinds of served meals and hors d'oeuvres, and we never knew what we were going to have. You know, I always tell the story that the first Sunday I was there at the base, I thought, well, we can sleep in. But all the Marines in the barracks, they're all getting up real quick. And I said, this is Sunday, isn't it? And they says, yes, but they serve steak and eggs for breakfast on Sunday in the Marine Corps. So I quickly got dressed and went to breakfast. You know, you live and learn these customs these people have, you know. So that was the best food we had. NAS Jacksonville had first of all, the dining room was beautiful, all glass. I'm sure it's still there. And it was so big that they marched in 4 abreast. And as fast as they could march in, they could serve them in that building. It was, it was unbelievable how good the food was with that many people going in. So I don't remember any place that it was really bad. And during the peace conference in San Francisco, they kept the dining room open from early morning till night because the different people, we had this army that was chauffeuring, they had limousines from the wealthy people in Palm Beach, lent them their nice cars, and they were the chauffeurs and they didn't know when they were called to. And so as a result, you could eat any time and as often as you wanted. So unfortunately, the peace conference didn't last forever. And you talk about humorous. One of the funniest things I saw was at the Mark Hopkins, which is in those days the bar on the top of it. You know, you could look right at the Golden Gates. And the Saudis were staying there. And they'd gone to Golden Gate State Park to ride horses. Well, after riding the horses, they rode back to the Mark Hopkins and startled the doorman by saying, "Take care of the horses." So it was a rare occasion, you know. So they just happened to think about that.
Jim, what'd you do for a living after the war?
Well, I didn't want to go back in the funeral business. And the only other thing I'd ever done is between my junior and senior year in high school, I'd worked at the St. George Hotel in St. Augustine. So some of the buddies from there I was in service with were trying to get me to come to New York, so I thought, hey, I'm off. And I absolutely didn't want to go. After the death and whatnot I saw during the war, I didn't want to go back to the funeral business. And so I went there to a big hotel and applied for a job. And of course the only reference I had was the St. George, but I knew several hotels, especially down on Miami Beach, that the Army Air Force had taken over that somebody else had now. I never forget the Ed Singer. I put those hotels down as a reference. And so then I worked at the Mayflower and the Fifth Avenue at Ninth Avenues. I got by, and so I spent the rest of my life.
Nice hotels.
Mm-hmm. The what?
Those are very nice hotels.
Unfortunately, when I went up a few years ago to see the Mayflower, it was a hole in the ground.
Oh, really?
Torn it down, and there's now a big condominium there.
Emily, Rachel, any questions?
There's a lot of information covered, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you have any children?
Do you have any children?
No, I was never married. So I don't think I have any children.
You never know, Jim. Are we good? Tony? Mr. Ponce, I cannot thank you enough.
Well,